my future. Not my test's future, not my teacher's future, not even my school's future. For I dream of a day where I can say, wow, I learned something and feel better as a whole, rather than the hole I feel in my stomach after a certainly failed test. I dream of a future where teachers will teach the student, not grade them. Well, they'll correct the student, not base their worth off of a number. I dream of a future where people will be graded on how much they've learned, rather than learning about how much they've been estimated. This poem by a writer who goes with the name Verdant Quo shows his position on modern ideals of assessment. In this, Quo paints a picture of the damage and diminishment that he has felt with the current grading system. He feels as though he has been, quote, reduced to a number and diminished to a score. He then goes on to explain his dreams of a future where schools will aid in nurturing students' growth and where he will be able to understand the depths of his education. And most importantly, where learning is taught for learning's sake. Not his test's sake, his teacher's sake, or his school's sake, but for his own academic and character development. Unfortunately, this is only one case among countless with the same dream. Rather than seeking to create an efficient worker through the education system, learning and teaching should aim to grow the mind. Education should teach students to think and reason for themselves, that they may ultimately be prepared to fulfill their vocation in Christ. Focusing specifically on this topic of assessment, we can see that the current assessment system used in classical education is inconsistent with its goals, causing detrimental effects where an aid for growth should be influenced. Progressivism has plagued the modern education system and will continue to do so if the status quo is not challenged. In this presentation, the letter grade assessment system will be discussed, focusing specifically on its detrimental influence in classical education. With the progressive goal to be job ready, reaching milestones by a specific time, perhaps this type of assessment is consistent. With the classical goal, however, to cultivate every aspect of the mind, academically as well as emotionally, philosophically, morally, and all in every aspect, these exclusive letter grades prove to be detrimental and inconsistent with the classical goal. I will begin by using data that I have found by conducting a survey within Trinity Christian School where I asked both the students and the teachers their opinion on this topic. Then, after exploring the data that I have found, I will relate it to higher research done by educational authors and psychologists, exploring the benefits of changing from a quantitative assessment system to a qualitative assessment. Then, after further explaining my case in point, I will go on to address a couple of expected questions that may arise with my proposed methodology. So, as with any topic, you must begin with history. Although we cannot imagine a world without grades or assessments as we define them, they're relatively new in the grand scheme of education. In fact, it was not until 1792 that Cambridge University professor and teacher William Farish had the first installation of assessments. When tutoring a student, he had the idea that, quote, a quantitative value should be given to human thought, constructing a mathematical concept of reality. This ultimately led to the idea that if a number could be given to human thought and development, then it could also be given to emotional qualities, such as love, hate, beauty, intelligence, and even sanity. This principle, though totally applicable to things such as inanimate objects, cannot be applied to human development. Although our educational culture is so inclined to accept this approach as a norm, I would argue that there are better ways to assess students that respect them as growing individuals. Building off of Farish's idea, Yale President Ezra Stiles in the early 1900s had the first standardization of categories. When he was grading his 58 students, he put them into 4 categories: optimi, dui optimi, inferiores, and peiores. Best, second best, inferior, and worse. Not only this, however, but in Stiles' Book of Averages, he mentions marking on a scale of 4, which is likely to be the origin of our 4.0 grade point average scale. These experiments done by William Farish and Ezra Stiles were the foundations for the grading system that we use today. However, it was not until 1897 where these two influential people, where their ideas were put in one. And this is when letter grades were adopted for assessment. This is where an A became representative of excellence, a B of good work, C, the student did fair, D, they barely passed, and E, the student had failed. This percentage that includes the letter, the short description, and of course a little percentage gap that goes along with each of them is what comprises the Mount Holyoke method. And the Mount Holyoke method is the basis of the college grading that we use today, that is even trickled down into secondary education and even elementary. This type of assessment system, being so widely accepted among prestigious as well as private and public institutions, it has become harder for any institution to move against the grain. What I would argue, however, is that it has become even harder for the classical goal to be attained. With intellectual, emotional, and spiritual growth all being reduced to number, it becomes very hard for the classical goal to be attained. So in view of this rising progressivism in education, I do not support using progressively modeled assessment systems in a classical institution. What I do support, however, is using a written assessment system. Now, what is a written assessment system? A written assessment system is an expression of a student's grasps on the concepts, notating where they have had successes, shortcomings, and where they need improvement, focusing specifically on how the student can improve in order that their education can be furthered. This type of assessment not only addresses the academic aspect of learning, but also addresses the character development in the student as well. As I've studied this subject a lot, I have focused my area of studies into three sections. The first area of my studies focused on the motivational aspect behind gradation. I wanted to first see if with the progressive assessment system, the classical goal could be attained. In my own experience, and I feel as though in many of my peers' experience, my interest in academics has been reduced to pursuing a good grade. So when I asked the students in the survey, why do you pursue your education? I was not surprised with the outcome. Of my respondents, 70% reported that they study for the grade itself, not for actual academic growth. This is not only a fact found in my research, however, but educational author and psychologist Alfie Kohn reported that grading orientation and learning orientation are inversely related. This means that when grades are introduced, the actual pursuit for academic growth plummets. Students are so focused on how well they're doing, when in reality they should be more focused on what they're doing and why they're doing it. Although the idea that these grades motivate students to excellence may seem valid, students only pursue their grades for the wrong reasons. In fact, the other 25% of my respondents reported that they pursue their education to, quote, be on the sports teams, stay on good terms with my parents, to feel accomplished, and to get into the colleges that I want to. These extrinsic motivations of the student show the negative effects that letter gradation has had on the academic aspect of learning. Secondly, my studies focused on the emotional side of gradation. Although these grades were intended to encourage students to achieve their highest, they have misled students into thinking that these grades are the end goal of their education. For example, when a teacher tells his class that what they're learning is going to count towards their grade, their response will likely be to avoid taking any unnecessary intellectual risks. They're going to choose the easier assignment in order to minimize the chance of them doing poorly. This is not because they're unmotivated, this is because they're reasonable. Kohn responds that these students are simply, quote, responding to adults who, by telling them that high marks is the goal, have underlyingly told them that success matters more than learning. Instead of a love of learning being cultivated in these students, they are faced with emotional toil when they have the failing grade, because they see it as a permanent sign of failure in their own life. With the end goal of their education being told, with letter grades being told that they are the end goal of education, the actual learning process becomes a burden, rather than an opportunity for growth. In fact, one of the most influential responses that I received from a student was that grades discourage me. They discourage me from spending time with my family, from doing things that I love, from keeping up with my health, and ultimately for life. And that is where I feel the education system has failed me. Rather than these letters improving student life academically, spiritually, and emotionally, they only burden students from furthering their education and loving the process of growth. And third, my areas of studies focused on the actual effectivity of grading in itself. So I asked the students, do grades in and of themselves, meaning the A, the 97%, or the C, the 76%, do these grades in and of themselves help you to understand what you did well and how you can improve? I once again was not surprised with the results. 85% of the respondents said that no, these grades do not at all help me to further my academic growth. 10% said partially, they do help a little bit, leaving only 5% to say, yes, they totally help me in my academic development. One student even went as far to say that letter grades are very discouraging. They only acknowledge your success or your failure without actually providing any help. They rather tear us down and give us a false sense of security, depending on the grade that we receive. They distract us from the actual purpose of education, learning. We can see from these student respondents that these marks do not actually help students to pursue truth, engagement, and maturity. Rather, these abstract letters and numbers take away from cultivating a love of learning. With the written assessment, however, accompanied by teacher and student discussion, students will be able to better grasp their success in their studies, their shortcomings, and specifically how to further develop their education. These written assessments, as researchers have found, quote, promote deep thinking and a desire to engage. Now, with this slightly controversial and very impactful topic, I would like to address a couple of questions that may arise with this methodology. So first, the question arises, well, how will I know if my student is doing well without these grades? This, of course, is a totally valid question. However, I would argue that with these qualitative grades, teachers and parents will be able to better understand their students' growth with written feedback on each assignment. Though this process may take longer and it's not as quick as simply glancing at a letter or a number or comparing it to another student's, you'll be able to look into the student's improvement, their growth, and even their character development. Secondly, the question of objectivity arises. First, it is important to recognize that objectivity in any sense, especially in grading, is not possible. No teacher grades as same as the next, nor do preset criteria help to achieve full objectivity. People are all independent, biased thinkers who have different standards for different criteria. What may be a 3 out of 10 for a teacher could be a 5 or a 6 for any others. There's absolutely no way to achieve objectivity, and that is a part of human nature. Furthermore, I would argue that this objectivity is undesirable in assessing students. With qualified teachers and small class sizes provided by classical education, teachers are highly qualified and more than sufficient in judging their students' growth. However, we can recognize that growth cannot be fully addressed with a letter or a number. If the purpose of these assessments are to mature students in every aspect, it is foolish for us to believe that a letter could aid in doing that and address every aspect of learning. And finally, probably the largest question arises with my proposed methodology is the transcripts. How will my student transfer from a qualitative-based institution to a letter grade-based institution? Now, don't worry, I am not completely blind to the outside world, nor do I think that my presentation will change every educational institution. When a student graduates from high school or they want to transfer from this school to probably a letter grade-based institution, they will need a transcript to show their academic achievement. As I've studied this no-grade system, I've come across many ways that can provide these transcripts and this change while still being consistent with the classical goals. Perhaps one of the best alternatives that I have found is this ghost transcript method. This ghost transcript is created from 9th through 12th grade in the high school years of the student. After each semester, the teacher will give the student a quantitative grade, meaning the percentage or the letter, based on the qualitative assessment that the teacher has been giving to the students throughout the semester. The hopes with starting this assessment system, this transcript only in 9th grade, is that students will be so accustomed to only receiving these written feedbacks, and they will be learned in pursuing education for its true purpose, that they will not pursue these arbitrary letters for the wrong reasons. With this bridge being made from the qualitative-based institution to the quantitative, students will not be tempted in pursuing these grades for the wrong reasons. However, furthermore, they will be aimed to mature as these assessments should. With this implementation, students' view of education would greatly mature and refocus them on the true purpose of their education. Life should not be driven by a grade. One's future should not be preceded by a letter, and worth should not be defined by numbers presented on a paper. By seeking to be efficient and practical, the classical education system has been hindered, compromising part of its purpose in the making. We are not lifeless beings made to be computerized into memorizing data, nor should we believe that this is the purpose. Rather, God has created humanity in his image, unique, complex, relational individuals made to glorify and enjoy their Creator. Therefore, as every aspect of life should, education should seek to raise students in critique and encouragement, that they may understand their academic abundance set out for their Creator. Modern assessments, however, only aid students in idolizing grades, taking away their desire for learning and handing them discouragement in the process. With both teachers and students recognizing this, how can it keep being overlooked? For this reason, among many others that I've presented, I fully support removing the letter and number percentage system, grading system in classical education. With written assessments, students will be able to further their maturity in every sense, without the fear of penalizing marks staying with them forever, ultimately helping them to understand their calling in Christ. These assessments are not simply about the work that students produce, nor should we believe that they only affect students academically. Rather, this education shapes the ideology of students in every sense. Classical education must continue to move against the grain, living counterculturally for what we believe is good, true, and beautiful. Thank you.